Yes.
Yes.
Aye.
Yes. Thank you. Good catch there, Edie, or Eddie. Eddie. All right. What I want to do now is turn it over to Ashley to talk about the Title IX and Clery landscape. Go ahead, Ashley.
Thank you, Mr. Sparks. I am going to share my screen if that's okay. Looks like I'm allowed. And for those of you who we've met before or talked through this, some of this will be a little bit familiar. I was trying to do a bit of a groundwork and then talk a little bit about updates and some of the specific work of Martin this year. It's been really impressive, and a huge thank you to a number of people on the campus, on the ground that do this work, and a huge thank you to Edie, who has been like a champion for all of us moving the agenda forward. So I wanted to say that up front. She would have edited me out if she could have, but I'm not going to let that pass. So thank you all for inviting me tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have anytime during this brief presentation. So I want to give you just a bit of an overview where we are. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Title IX is defined currently, Martin's commitment, some regulatory updates. We'll talk about Clery briefly and just talk about the future and any questions that you all have. One of the reasons I'm here is we had an external evaluation of the system in 2017, and one of the recommendations was that the boards, at that time it was the central board, but even more importantly, I think as things have evolved with the campus advisory boards, just have a, sort of like the 30,000 foot view and know what your campuses are doing around this work, and also where your responsibility is for the work. Title IX is a relatively short statute and has been interpreted a number of ways. And as you know, there have been changes this year specifically to Title IX. And so I'm going to talk about how those are incorporated. But I think just remembering it's discrimination on the basis of sex from a program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so that applies in a number of ways to our campuses. So I always talk about Pat Summitt's connection to this because I think it is remarkable about Tennessee's contribution to Title IX. And while Title IX has been talked about more in the sexual harassment landscape over the past few years, the contributions of athletics and Title IX to athletics and Pat Summitt specifically are a huge component of this work. So I always start with Pat Summitt's life because she was born here in Tennessee in Clarksville, just down the road from y'all. And in 52 and 67, Syracuse University Junior was the first woman to participate in the Boston Marathon. So if you think about it on the timeline, that's not that long ago. In 72, Title IX is signed into law, and in 74, Pat Summitt graduates from UT Martin and becomes the coach of the University of Tennessee women's basketball team, which is not an NCAA sanctioned sport at that time. In 76, Pat Summitt makes a big impact on basketball in the state of Tennessee, and here's why. Cape versus TSSAA. So Cape was Victoria Cape, and she sued the TSSAA to make women's basketball a full court sport. And Pat Summitt was her expert witness because Pat Summitt made the point that as a University of Tennessee Knoxville basketball coach, she could not recruit from the state if our women were not playing on the full court. And so that's one of the ways Pat Summitt changed the state. And obviously there's so many more. 76, women's basketball becomes an Olympic sport. In 1980, Alexander versus Yale incorporates sexual harassment under sex discrimination. So that sex discrimination you see in the statute incorporates sexual harassment starting in 80. In 80, the Department of Education establishes oversight of Title IX through the Department or the Office of Civil Rights. 82, women's basketball comes in NCAA sport. In 1984, women's basketball team wins the gold medal at the Olympics. Who is their coach? Pat Summitt. So Pat Summitt's life and time evolves over time, and her contributions to our state were immense in Title IX and just athletics in general. But as you come forward in time, we look at this evolution of Title IX. And so 2001, we had a pretty significant guidance experience there. In 2011 and 13, under the Obama administration, we saw the Dear Colleague letter issued, and we saw the Violence Against Women Act reauthorized. One of the original authors of the Violence Against Women Act was Joe Biden. And so we can expect that now that his administration is in the White House, we will likely see additional Title IX changes to come. In 2017, the Trump administration withdrew the 2011 Dear Colleague letter and did their own Title IX regulations, which were issued in May, and our implementation deadline was August of 2020. So we have had some significant change in that area, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Martin's response to that. Martin has a Title IX commitment that is mirrored by all of the campuses and institutes in the University of Tennessee system. And that is with an emphasis on 5 areas. So policy, prevention, education, supportive measures, investigation and resolution, and patterns and trends. And although this model was established before the 2020 regulation changes, the model still applies and complies with the regulation. So we made one language revision. Supportive measures used to be interim measures. That was the previous guidance, and now we use support measures. But otherwise, our model didn't change because our model has always been, and I believe continues to be, a due process model, a model that looks at both parties as individuals who are part of our communities, and how we address these issues are with that approach. So just to give you some context, even though the regulations made some significant changes, our model didn't have to change. When we did come into the Title IX transition, UT Martin, as did the rest of our campuses and institutes, had a lot of work to do in a very tight time frame. So I want to thank all of the individuals listed on your left, and I saw Dr. Luter is on this call too, to just say we could not have done this without all of those people and all of those contributions, and worked so closely with the system to make sure that we all move forward together. So now you will see the policy that your campus has is similar, not identical to UT Knoxville and not identical to Chattanooga, but with the same definitions and which much of the same process. One, because we were all complying with the same regulation, but two, because we all worked together to make sure that we could support each other. It would make our prevention work seem more seamless and would become a more system level policy, so that when there are challenges to the policy, we're all on the same page. And when there are questions, we can all work together. We continue to meet weekly, all of the Title IX coordinators across the system. We've backed it down from 2-hour meetings at a time to about 30 minutes. It's an opportunity to keep us all on the same page. Martin worked hard to get buy-in across the board. So those are your implementation meetings you see there, with all of those members on the left working together on almost a weekly basis across to move that regulatory shift forward. And then August 13th, providing sort of that UT Martin town hall, giving people an opportunity to ask questions, to see the revisions, and to make that change fairly seamless. As far as the regulation, just give you a couple highlights so that you know what is different. Title IX sexual harassment was defined by the regulation in 2020, and so that definition you will see in the UTM policy. There are 3 prongs for sexual harassment, and those 3 prongs are laid out there. The location of incidents, so Title IX only applies to incidents that take place within a program, educational program or activity, and does not apply outside the United States. One of the things that came up with this is international travel, or if there was an experience off campus, let's say at a house that's not affiliated with a student org, but still affiliated as far as it was students involved. And so that became some of the work that we had to do around the policy. You'll find that Martin's policy is a bit broader than Title IX, period. So your policy includes Title IX and non-Title IX allegations. That was important for campus communities. It was also important for institutions to be able to retain control, that if a faculty member had, if there was a sexual assault by a faculty member off campus, we wanted to be able to address that. You certainly don't want to be able to only address what happens in your campus geography. And so we made sure that our policy addresses Title IX and non-Title IX violations, and applies the hearing process as required by the regulation. So the regulation had 7 other sort of key areas. It applies to students, faculty, and staff, which is a fairly unique to this. We had not historically applied the faculty and staff realm in the same way we had to students, but the regulation now requires that. The regulation required that we identify a standard of evidence. Our current standard of evidence is the preponderance of evidence. It requires a right to an advisor, both for the complainant and the respondent, which was historically not the way that work was done. It was just an advisor for the respondent. And so now both the complainant and the respondent have an advisor. Investigations, there were a number of aspects to investigations that became required. The timeline is very specific, and all of that is outlined by the policy so that anyone who enters this process knows what to expect, and anyone who's facilitating the process knows the timeline and requirements. Live hearing is a requirement of the regulation. It is required unless you get to some other resolution, but in a case where an allegation is made against a faculty or staff member by a student, a live hearing will take place as long as that person is still our employee. Cross-examination is required by the regulation. A number of people had real concerns about that. What I will tell you as far as how we've managed that and what I feel really comfortable with is that the parties never question each other. The regulation actually doesn't allow that. That was a lot of confusion for people, but the cross-examination takes place by the advisor. That's why you have to have one. And so the opportunity to ask questions and to verify information through cross-examination is allowable for the complainant, respondent, and witnesses. But again, they will never cross each other. So that was something that we are clear in our process, and that is also why they are all required to have an advisor. As far as appeals, both parties have appeals. Those appeals must be outlined in your policy, and ours are. They're also outlined in our codes of conduct, which align with our policies. Just to give like a real quick overview of Clery, because these two work quite closely together. The Clery Act was historically and is formally named the Jean Clery Disclosure of Campus Security Policy Crime Statistic Act. It applies to all colleges and universities that participate in federal student aid, and the compliance is monitored by the Department of Education, so same as Title IX. That is your annual security report, your 2020 annual security report. I would say that that team, we have a weekly meeting with campus, and many of the same members that were on that transition team meet weekly with myself, Rachel Powell from General Counsel, and Christina Maradian, who's with the system, working specifically with Clery, with Martin. And I would tell you that you have done, and your campus and the individuals on your campus have done an outstanding job to bring Clery compliance where it needs to be at the University of Tennessee Martin. And we could not have done that without 100% administrative support from Dr. Carver and just the sweat equity of a number of people who have done the work. Clery Act and Title IX have a different overlap than they historically did, but I wanted to sort of update that for you so you can see it. VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, again, that's the one that historically was written by Joe Biden, so we can expect to see potential expansion there, but currently that is where the overlap between Clery and Title IX takes place. It applies to crimes committed in specific geographic locations. It applies who is a campus security authority. It requires certain alerts. So, and Clery, it includes those VAWA crimes, but it also includes a number of other crimes, and including violent crimes, and requires crimes to be recorded on a daily crime log and the annual security report. One of the reasons we often talk about these two things together is that oftentimes people will come into a campus because of an allegation of Title IX, meaning the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Ed to evaluate, but then where you end up with your findings, and to be quite frank, where you end up with your money is Clery. Clery is very easy to prove and reconcile, at least retroactively. And so that's one of the things that we've worked really hard to make sure everybody is on the same page. So this is that UTM review team that meets weekly. Edie Gibson, and again, an unsung hero for pushing our team along. You have Joe Henderson, who's your Title IX coordinator. Dr. Luder, of course, Ryan Martin with Residence Life. Housing is an area with Clery and Title IX that you want to be sure you have a very tight rein on what's happening, how it's getting reported, and Ryan does an outstanding job there. Christina Maradian, I mentioned, Shannon Perry, who is your conduct officer, Rachel Powell, who works for General Counsel, and Chad Worley, who works for UTM Public Safety and who is the current Clery Act coordinator. And Chad has done a lion's share of work to get Clery where it needs to be, so I cannot compliment your team enough. Over 2021, the UTM has improved data collection, enhanced your Campus Security Authority program, made changes to website, updated to reporting forms, enhanced tracking and training of campus security authorities, improved student conduct and Title IX processes, clarified protocols, increased support staff, trained hearing officers, has this care team case manager that works with the team, developed online reporting capabilities, and modified the UTM police response tracking system. And all of those things were things that either had some connection to the audit concerns or just the ability to create a more robust system. And what I'll tell you is, I always say compliance is the floor, and I think this group has moved from the floor and is going towards the ceiling as far as working towards making these things not only compliant, but something that UTM can rely on and be quite proud of. When we talk about the future, I always talk about the future. Historically, I've talked about the future as prevention. And what I'll say is that over time, I've learned that you can't do prevention if you don't have good compliance. And so we're going to have to say the future is collaboration between prevention and compliance. And so we ask, and what I believe UT Martin is working to do is identify high-risk populations, set expectations with faculty, staff, and students, acknowledge changes in culture. One of our biggest risks are faculty and staff who've worked at institutions for a long-term period of time, who have an idea about what the cultural climate maybe once was, and then what the current expectations are. Addressing low-level behaviors, addressing known secrets, educating new faculty or any visitors to our campuses, and increase campus-level training. And I believe Martin is taking a proactive approach to all of those things. As far as compliance, who holds us accountable is obviously the Department of Ed, but what I will tell you is we are seeing, and I think we'll continue to see growing, is funding organizations. So your grant organizations, so National Science Foundation, NASA, National Institutes for Health, the USDA, a number of organizations who provide money or support PIs and co-PIs on research grants and other things on our campuses. They're putting sort of their money where their stated values are. And so they don't hold institutions accountable when we have a PI or co-PI who has an allegation or a finding, but they do hold us accountable for reporting it. And then they will work with the campuses to try to keep the money, but will consider the PI or co-PI based on the concern or complaint. So I think that's just really important to keep in your back pocket as far as why these things have growing significance. So it's not just a regulatory compliance, but it's also our grant and funder compliance. So that was a whole lot of information in a very short script, but I wanted to get to any questions you all have, concerns, anything that people have brought to you that might be important to talk about. I'm happy to.
Actually, this is Art. I've got a question that is not intended to be political. If inappropriate, say, no, I'm not going to answer it, and Keith can cut me off. But President Biden has come out with the transgender thing. It looks, for sports and things like that. Will that be covered under Title IX? Will there be something separate? I'm at a loss of who's going to control that.
Sure. And I think that's a fine question to ask.
That's non-political. I
think it's a fine question to ask. And from an administrative perspective, those are things things that are on the future burner. I think a couple things will happen. Right now, we get our guidance around those things from the NCAA. So the regulatory agency is likely who will get guidance from. We'll also get guidance likely from court cases and other things. And so the short answer is I don't really know the answer to that yet. I think that we'll be monitoring. I think K-12 has a clearer picture on some of that, but we don't have that clear of a picture yet. So I think I'm uncertain about what that will look like, but I think we will get a lot of guidance likely from NCAA.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions of Ashley?
Ashley, this is Philip Smart. I'm over in Ag, and I used to be the faculty senate president, and I've gotten this question a number of times, and I would like for you to kind of tell me what can we say to folks to alleviate their concerns. I've had a number of male faculty members say to me they're very concerned about false accusations, and they're concerned that a student feels like they need to get a better grade in a class, or they need some kind of assistance, and that they may be blackmailed, saying, if you don't help me out here, I'm going to accuse you of something. What can you say to faculty to alleviate their fears that they're going to get a fair hearing on this?
So, and I think that's a good question as well. And I've gotten asked that question a few times, not just by faculty, but staff as well, and students too. And I think that in addition to the regulatory developments over the summer, even if those things change 180, I will tell you some of the things about them that I think are really useful, and is that the process is incredibly transparent. I think one of the things that I always tell people is, and I've had people ask, what if it was your husband? What if he was a kid? Well, I would say, put it through the process. No one's going to hold anybody hostage for an allegation. And what I would say in addition to that is, it is a thorough process. These investigations are thorough. People provide information. And the expectation is that the investigator is a neutral fact finder. Their job is not to represent either party. Their job is to determine whether the institution, whether there was a violation of institution policy. And so what I always tell people, and this is because I truly believe it, is that the process is not for process sake. The process is to come to a resolution and conclusion. And so I would just encourage anyone who feels, I mean, you know, if someone threatens to blackmail someone, that's a violation as well. And so I think it's really important that people just be as transparent and forthcoming as possible. And they have a right to an advisor. They have a right to an attorney if they make that decision. So they have a number of rights, and we don't have the ability, and nor do we want the ability, to summarily decide something about someone based on an allegation alone. And so is it desirable to have an allegation? No, right? Nobody wants that to happen. But if it does happen, I always recommend that people come forward and just share their truth. I mean, that's all you can show up with, right? And I think that our evidentiary standard is a reasonable one for this. I think our process is well defined, and I think people also have appeals. And so I think there are a number of ways to put forth your truth and your experience. And you know, and I can appreciate. I mean, I think you see it on the other side as well. Complainants are often very uncomfortable coming forward because they're concerned that someone will think they are lying. And so I think you see it on both sides. And what I can assure them is, this part of our job is to be neutral fact finders, not to create or give credit or credence to anything specific. And so I think just encouraging them. And I don't know, this is kind of country on my part, but I always say, just live who you are every day. And, you know, and if somebody accuses you of something, you have an opportunity to come forward with who you are every day and address the allegation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And I encourage people not to put themselves in positions, and I'll just be honest about that. I think historically in higher ed, there was a lot of, you know, more socializing and things like that. And I think, you know, you can also not put yourself in positions that may put you at greater risk, you know, drinking with students, having students, a single student to your house, going alone to a bar or restaurant with a student. I think those are types of things that put you at real risk. And I think that's a choice that people can actively make.
Thank you. Any other questions? Monique, you're an attorney. Surely you got a question. Not hearing any. Ashley, thank you. That was a very comprehensive.
Oh, I think she maybe had one. Are you muted?
I was muted. Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, that was just a very thorough presentation. I really learned a lot.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm happy anytime if there's something comes up and you think, now, what did she mean by that? Please holler at me. And Joe, Joe's a great partner. We work together all the time. And so you've got a good asset there on campus as well. And our goal, I mean, this is hard work, and these are hard issues on even a great day. And so our goal is to be clear and transparent and accurate. And that's the right thing, I think, always.
I agree with Monique. That was a great presentation. Appreciate it very much, Ashley.
Thank you, Mr. Sparks. Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dr. Carver.
Keith, who is going to do the infographics for 2024 and 2020?
Art, that will be me. So I'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to welcome John Woolfolk. I see John is entered into our Brady Bunch squares as we look on the screen. And John, sure appreciate your engagement and you being here with us today. Well, we're going to spend a few minutes on this with our campus enrollment management update coming next. I thought it might be nice to look at a snapshot of where we are in terms of our entering class that just came in. So when you look at the class of 2024, we were very concerned. We were in the throes, still in the recruiting cycle for bringing a senior class on when COVID hit, but really had a nice number. So when we look at our total head count of 7,100 students, we were able to recruit 1,100 freshmen. As you can see in one of your infographic boxes below, 99% of those were full-time students. Great number for us, down slightly from the year before, but not a significant number. So we were very pleased when many other colleges received between a 6 to 8 decline in their enrollment, and we felt really good about where we were. We were blessed. As you can see, with this entering class, agriculture, nursing, engineering, top 3 majors. When you look at agriculture now, and I'm not saying this just because Philip Smart is on the screen, it's popular major here. We've got great faculty. We've got a great tradition of UT Martin of teaching agriculture. But when you look at it, there are over 1,000 agriculture majors on this campus. And when you look at the graduate school and the job placement rates, it's hot. Their students are leaving here with great jobs. They're getting into great professional and master's and PhD level programs. And it's only going to continue to grow. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get into the future of enrollment. 24 states and 3 countries in this freshman class. Obviously, the biggest number of those freshmen coming from the 68 counties in Tennessee that we were able. I tell you this every year, guys, eventually we're going to have a student from all 95 counties. If I have to drive to Sequatchie County and bring one to campus, we're going to do it. We're going to get all over. 18 ROTC cadets. ROTC is alive and well here. That's a big group of freshmen that are coming in for ROTC. 99 student athletes. Now, the biggest thing to look at here is this class was overwhelmingly female. When you look, 62% of our entering freshmen were female this year. I want to go ahead and flip over to the next slide. This is our snapshot of our entire student body last fall. And you can see 5,100 of those were full-time degree-seeking undergraduate and graduate students. And where you see a huge jump is those that are we're having more master's students enrolled in master's programs attending. I want to call your attention down to that 53.7% 6-year graduation rate. So a little over half of our students graduate in 6 years. You all need to know that percentage point over a 4-year period has gone up 6 percentage points. It's really hard to move a percentage point in a 6-year graduation rate. So we're really happy with what we're seeing. Now, where do we need to be? We need to be in the 60th percentile very quick, and we're going to get there. We're going to continue to work, but I'm real excited about the 6 percentage point jump that we've seen in a very short time. If you look at the top 10 majors, you'll see it does mirror somewhat in those first 2 with agriculture and nursing. However, health and human performance does overtake engineering. Engineering is a little further down the list. Now, with the Latimer building, engineering and natural science building that's coming up right now, will be open next April of 2022. We really think you're going to see engineering take a leap. And obviously you saw in our freshman class, it was the 3rd most popular major. So we think engineering among all students is going to become very popular. A couple more things I want to say. 47% of our students at UT Martin are Pell eligible. What does that mean? It means that they're coming from households whose annual income gets them at that level that they're eligible to take Pell money. And when we look at that crowd, traditionally Pell eligibility first generation, those are viewed as conditions that can really hinder academic progress. So we still feel like it's our mission. We're an access campus, and it's our job to get our Pell-eligible students, get our adult students, our student soldiers, our veterans, our first-generation students, and make sure we graduate them. And that's truly a mission and something we're acutely focused on right now. We've got a 16-year-old taking classes from us. We also have a 72-year-old taking classes from us. That's the range right now. We're awfully proud of that, and excited about, equally excited about all those age ranges being here. Finally, and then I think we'll have some questions for Sylvia when we get, I want to get into her presentation. 38% of our students that graduated last year graduated debt-free. That's up. It had been 34%. Now it's 38%. And I think we're really doing the best job we can educating students when they come in about if you have to take a loan, how much you need to take out. Don't take out everything that you can get. Take out exactly what you need to get through school. So it's an education process, but I think as we continue to work on low tuition rates, I think as we continue to work with families and students on educating them about student loans and debt, I think it's going to get, it's even more and more of our students are going to graduate debt-free. So with that, I think it might be good if we move Edie into Sylvia. Sylvia, did I see you at the bottom?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Keith,
yeah.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I got a question. How do we compare, and I'm just going to pick SEMO, Murray, Austin P. How do we compare our numbers up, down with what those particular institutions are doing?
With graduation rates, we're right on par. We're right on par with our OVC peers. Regionally, in the state of Tennessee, we're a little better with our graduation rates.
Okay.
But OVC, we're right on par. Our OVC peers in Tennessee a little better. So, but we've got to get up into the 60th percentile on our graduation rate soon, and we're committed to do that. We're committed to do that. So, you know, it's a great question.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right. I guess and this is where Keith was going, we'll go to Sylvia for a campus enrollment management update. Sylvia, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, sir. Well, it's nice to meet you guys, and thank you for having me. My name is Sylvia Ewell. I am a financial aid consultant with a firm called Ruffalo Noel Levitz. We work with higher education across the country. I've been working specifically with Martin for about 5 years on our scholarship and financial aid strategy. And so each October-ish, I meet with the campus and we talk through what's happening in higher education in general, and then specifically strategies for UTM. And so Dr. Carver thought you guys might be interested in some of that high-level overview. So that's really what I was planning on reviewing with you guys today. Feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions. And I have to find where I can share my screen. Here we go. All right. Guys, let me know if you can see that. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, Sylvia.
We can.
Okay, perfect. All right. So again, Ruffalo Noel Levitz, we work with campuses. Our focus is on obviously whatever our clients' outcomes are. So for a campus like UT Martin, obviously you've been in growth mode. Some campuses are looking for more diversity. Obviously, we know that's going to be an issue for campuses moving forward. So really focus on our campus's successes as our measure of outcomes. So the great Yogi Berra, once one of his yogiisms was, the future ain't what it used to be. And I think I've been using this for a couple of years within higher education. Things have been shifting, but right now I think it could be applicable to any part of our world with so much uncertainty out there. But the general overview of today's kind of landscape with trends in financial aid and higher education are really kind of multifaceted here. We see high school graduates have been declining since 2017. We're looking at kind of a collapse, particularly over the next 10 years or so, as we have just there were literally fewer babies being born. So there's just not enough students out there for us to recruit from. The diversity of those students has changed. In just the next few years, we're going to see almost half of enrollment coming from students of color. There's obviously some completion gaps that are in place with some of those students as well. So watching that. So again, Dr. Carver, I'm glad you guys are focusing in on where those things are. Affordability continues to be an issue. Loan indebtedness, as you just mentioned, Dr. Carver, is a huge piece. And so anytime we can get more financial literacy out there and help students understand costs and aid, all of those pieces and how they kind of fit together, I think we're definitely in a better position within higher education as total. But we'll talk a little bit about how aid has kind of decreased over time. There are fewer loan options. There are fewer outside aid options. But costs continue to increase as our cost to deliver education continues to go up. And we're not getting a lot of outside funding, federal, state, et cetera. And then discount rates. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with what a discount rate is, but I'll spend a little time on that as well. Basically, we're looking at the cost, the actual net cost that comes to a student, how much we are able to discount that either with outside funds or campus funds. And then, and we've seen that continue to grow as the gap for aid and what's available for students has grown. The costs have grown. Family incomes have not grown. And so we've seen that stay steady. As the costs go up, that gap gets larger. And so campuses are trying harder and harder to find resources to help fill those gaps for students. And then in relation a little bit to retention, obviously it costs quite a bit to enroll a student, but it costs even more if we lose them and have to replace them. It's much less expensive to keep students. So keeping that revenue in place for those students as they're enrolled. So all of these items were already pretty big things that were moving the landscape. And then, COVID-19 hit us about this time last year. And so we did, as a company, have kind of pivoted and tried to help campuses manage some of that. And we put together some data that I think could be helpful for you guys to understand how this has impacted students' decision-making and that process as we went along. So we, as a company, work with close to 300 campuses around the country on their financial aid services. And so we grabbed data from the last 3 years. You can see the in counts for the institutions here, where we had data for these campuses for all 3 years. So a little over 1 million records for each year, and wanted to really look and see what we were seeing with differences for yield rates and for melt rates, both for first year and for transfer students. So just a little definitions here. Yield rate is the percentage of our admitted students who enroll. So if we admit 100 students and 20 enrolled, then our yield rate is 20%. The average yield rate around the country has been a little in that 25% range. You can see here. It's dropped a little bit this year and has been dropping actually as we've made it easier for students to apply to more schools. They're applying to more schools. They're still only going to one school, so the yield rates have been declining slightly, but we saw the biggest drop we've seen in quite a while this year. Melt rates are those rates of the students who tell us they're coming. So sometime in the spring or summer, they raise their hand and say, yes, I'm coming to UT Martin, and then they don't. So looking at those melt rates as we look forward as well. To see how students are responding. So the first thing we did was grabbed the top 10 states with the highest COVID cases in place, of course. So I live right outside y'all. I live in Texas, in Fort Worth, Texas. So I'm always focused in on Tennessee and Texas and the variances there. You can see when we look at these that almost all of the states saw a drop in yield. This green bar compared to the 2 previous years, including Tennessee. Texas and Wisconsin, California a little bit were outliers. We do not have a large percentage of students who leave Texas on a regular basis to go to school, and I think we just kept more of those at home. And California, of course, they were kind of all in the same boat since they were all virtual for all the schools in California. But we did see a decline in that yield, that percentage of the admit pool that enrolled. In the state of Tennessee. For UT Martin, we saw that decline as well. As Dr. Carver mentioned, you're still able to enroll a nice number of students, and there wasn't a huge decline in the enrollment, but the yield did drop about 2 points. For transfer students, we see a little bit more of a mixed bag. There's more campuses or more states that were able to maintain: Florida, North Carolina, Texas, again, Wisconsin. But the difference here being that these campuses, that transfer enrollment overall had a much larger drop than we saw in freshman enrollment for the fall 2020. Transfer students, I think, were stuck in the same environment that our current students were, right? They had on and offline and all those things that were happening. And so when we look now at the snapshot for fall 2020, the number of students or the percentage of students in that are enrolled in 2-year schools is down 10% overall from fall 19 to fall 20, all 2-year schools around the country. And 20% decline was in new students alone. So not only do we have fewer students enrolled in 2-year schools in general, we had many fewer start in a 2-year school this year. So I think that's going to trickle down to us as we're looking. You guys have always had great transfer enrollment numbers. You struggled a little bit with transfers as almost every campus did this fall with those 2-year students. So here we can see we looked at yield and melt by urbanization. So what size town or city or rural area were students coming from? So when you look at the green marks here, again, overall yield was down a little less than 2 points, and then melt rates were up because more students made different decisions. But the red numbers here is where we can see the largest declines that happen in yield rates, and those were in small, medium, and large cities and medium and large suburbs. So smaller towns, rural areas, and small cities, small suburbs all did reasonably well with yield rate in comparison to previous years. So we definitely saw a shift in students wanting to enroll in larger institutions in a larger town or city, particularly because they had applied to those schools early on in the cycle before there was COVID, then ultimately decided not to enroll there. Same thing with the melt rate. Again, we saw melt rates up kind of across the board. The only place where we see it actually go down is in this small suburb. But these larger areas saw bigger melt rates. This rural one's very interesting because this one we had didn't see much of a yield difference, but there was a little bit of a melt difference in this rural area. UT Martin's classified down here in the town space, so you can see with the comparisons there. All right. We also looked at it by institution size. We wanted to see how size played a part in that. And of course, this is using IPED's data where we place them into 5 bins, less than 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, and 20 plus. And you can see really as school size increases, those yield declines became a lot more apparent. We actually saw an increase in the yield rates of those campuses under 1,000 students. And then we see really the same thing with MELT. Institutions greater than 5,000 students really saw the biggest changes in MELT rates. Again, MELT rates were up slightly everywhere, including the smallest institutions, but that variance was larger on those larger campuses. Great. So we also broke it out by public and private institutions. So we can see here the private institutions dropped about 1.8 in yield rates, and sorry, that MELT got cut off. MELT went up by a point. And then down here for transfer students, we saw, not much of a change in the yield, but the MELT rate was much larger. So transfer students typically apply and are admitted a little bit later in the year, generally after March or so. So they may have applied to schools, but they changed their mind at a much higher rate than they have in previous years with what was happening out there. All right, so we also looked at distance from home. So there were a lot of things as we were having these conversations this spring where we felt like, do we think students are going to want to stay closer to home? Do we think they're going to want to go to smaller campuses or campuses in less populated areas? And we really did see all of that kind of transpiring. And you can see here, actually, the yield went up for the campuses within 100 to 250 miles. Over 250 miles, though, it dropped pretty dramatically. And we had almost 40% of the students in these sample sizes did apply to a campus out of state from their home state. But you can see not as many of them actually enrolled. The average distance for students for UT Martin is about 99 miles. So you guys are kind of in these two buckets here. And again, we didn't see the variance in yield for UT Martin as we did, as large as we did in other areas. And then again, the MELT rate was similar. At 250 miles or higher, we saw much higher MELT rates or larger numbers of students changing their mind about their original decision. We also looked at it by income levels. As Dr. Carver mentioned about Pell eligible students, that's a really important distinction. Pell students do, that basically that means if they're getting a full Pell Grant, that means the government and the federal government with their FAFSA has said this family can contribute $0 towards their education. They have no extra income whatsoever. So when we looked at yield rates, we did see overall around the country, we saw Pell eligible student numbers go down a lot. For UT Martin, we didn't see that the number of students who qualified for a Pell Grant was higher, but the yield on those students was actually a little bit lower, as we saw across the board. And you can see it here. This is by income, but families with less than $45,000 in income, you can see these gaps in yield, these big drops in yield. Stabilizes a little bit more in this middle area, but when we get to $75,000 and above, the yield goes up on almost every category. So it's very polarized. With where we saw changes, most campuses saw, the families with more capacity to pay were able to enroll at similar rates, and we saw fewer students in the lower income levels able to enroll. I thought I'd give you guys a little snapshot of what's happening right now. This is, I actually have as of January 8th, but December 31st is what we got into the deck for this report. So the percentage of students who are submitting a FAFSA, so the FAFSA is the document that families submit to determine their federal, state, and institutional gift aid. So we are seeing across the country about 11% decline in the number of FAFSAs that have been submitted to date. So they started submitting October 1st. So October through the end of the year as an 11% decline overall. In the South, we're seeing about a 12% decline. And in Tennessee, it's about 15%. So some good news, though, we are seeing a little bit of recovery. So as of January 8th, Tennessee's down to only 11% decline. So I think families are starting to now participate. We did anticipate that there would be fewer FAFSA filers this year just because there's fewer students enrolled, which we'll talk about demographics here in a minute. And so the anticipated decline was about 7.8% in Tennessee. Obviously, the decline's about double of that. So this gives you the volume. I know this is probably teeny tiny for y'all to see, but at this point last year, you had about 38,000 students in Tennessee that had filed. And at this point this year, where there's about 32,000. So that 15% represents about 6,000 students in the process. Oh, sorry, one more. said, right now, you guys are actually, for UT Martin, you have almost 50% of your admitted students that have filed. That's slightly lower, maybe 100 students or so from where you were at this point last year. So you're not as far behind as we're seeing kind of overall. But there is, again, some decline that we're seeing really kind of across the board. As a part of our data collection in the late spring, early summer, we partnered with a couple of other organizations to survey juniors and senior parents to see how they were feeling about the things that were happening. And as you can see, more than half of them were looking to maybe have their student enroll at a school that was closer to home. They were more likely to take virtual campus tours rather than traveling. They were concerned about their family's ability to pay. They're concerned about colleges' handling of emergency type situations. I think Dr. Carver knows he's probably the only president of the campuses I work with that I follow on Instagram, because I think he does a fantastic job of really getting, information out, not just the fun feel good stuff, but, you guys do a great job communicating with your students in transparency of all types of events. So that makes folks confident that you would also be able to handle an emergency situation. Obviously, more than half of parents said they were concerned about safety. About a third of parents, again, this past summer, were already saying, I think I might want my child to live at home and commute to college. So there's definitely some concerns swirling out there with this group. And again, this was 6 months ago, 8 months ago. And I think we all thought we'd maybe be a little further along with things by this point. So I think there still continues to be a lot of uncertainty. And that's really what we're seeing at the top of the funnel of recruitment, is that families are slower to apply to colleges this year. They're slower to do their financial aid. They're slower to make decisions about enrollment because they're really looking to see, what is the plan going to be? What is it really going to look like in September when my son or daughter goes to school? 95% of those parents also told us financial aid and scholarships was going to be very important in making decisions. 96% thought it was going to be really difficult to pay for their child's education. This, I think, is the most interesting to me. 50% of these parents thought college was going to cost more than it did before. So we have lots of conversations on our team with UTM about perception is reality, right? So we're actually not going to cost more, we put dollars and cents to it, but those opportunity costs are there, depending on how far away they are from campus. In addition, we see families' financial situations, of course, maybe have changed pretty dramatically, either in actuality or in perception, right? So sometimes families whose the investments aren't doing as well, they're feeling a little less confident in where they are financially. So this is, a lot of the conversation that we have had with campuses and ultimately with students around affordability and options that are available to them. It's also, you guys probably have seen this too. The COVID-19 situation has also affected athletic opportunities. So, and even, the seniors from last year obviously were impacted with everything being canceled. Juniors that are now seniors, a lot of them had things canceled or postponed in the spring. But, some of them continue to see some of that this fall. Depending on what region of the country that they're in, there's continued to be disruption and could still be in the spring. So athletics is a really important part of, most campuses' experience. And so, providing those opportunities, not just for students to play, but to even be recruited. I talked to an athletic director in a different part of the country who said they had students playing, but they weren't allowed to go watch because they could only have, one person from their family come watch, or one person per athlete. And so they can't even watch from afar. So that makes it obviously a little bit more difficult to go through that recruitment process. And then, of course, we also have some students that are already campus athletes that could potentially be extending eligibility and such. So this is the list that we kind of put together of what will be or what is different for this fall 21 recruitment cycle. Obviously, the team at UT Martin has been working on fall 2021 since the summertime while they were finishing fall 2020. But unfortunately, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. There's still a lot of uncertainty. I think parents and families are struggling to make decisions and even finish the process because they just don't know what's going to happen. The admissions folks haven't really been able to travel. They really haven't traveled fully since last fall. They didn't travel in the spring. They didn't travel in the summer. I've talked to Destin, regularly, and there's where the high schools are open and letting them come, they're able to go, but obviously not at the same volume or intensity as we have in the past. We can't host the big numbers of campus visitors with large scale events and things that we've been able to do in the past, where you guys have really shined. Students come to campus and they have such a great experience. They love it. And they want to be there. And it's just much more difficult to have those same types of experiences through a virtual environment. So again, not just trying to get more students to make decisions and yield, but just even trying to get them to raise their hands and apply. We saw it's starting to recover a little bit, but overall around the country, we saw college applications were down about 10% this fall. Again, families just aren't, it wasn't their priority. It wasn't what they were focused in on doing. And so the funnel that the number of students we're able to recruit from will be smaller with no travel restrictions, with students not really able to take tests, ACTs and SATs, a lot of uncertainty in the market. So we just have to really, do things a little bit better with the smaller group of students. The other piece, and this didn't affect Tennessee the way it affected a lot of other areas, your juniors take the ACT in school in the spring usually. So that was canceled, but then they were able to reschedule it early in the fall. So we do see standardized tests for almost all of the students from Tennessee. But for a lot of areas, because there wasn't as many test scores available and students don't have the capacity to take the test at the same rate, many campuses are looking at solely GPA. And so that has, again, changed really a lot about the system and the way it's being done. Obviously we continue to monitor what's happening with UT Martin. We do have, quite a few students that were admitted without a test score that we're still waiting on scores for. And so we'll continue to monitor if we need to make any adjustments there. But, again, families are more concerned about paying for college. So PPY for FAFSA, basically when a student submits their FAFSA, so for fall 21, they're going to include their fall 2019 tax information. So helping families understand that if your situation has changed dramatically since fall 2019, there are ways for us to help you through that process. So it is, again, gets a little bit more complicated as we move forward, but I have full confidence in the fantastic team at UT Martin that will be able to navigate all of these lovely opportunities. All right, switch modes. Questions so far? I do want to make sure. Oh, yeah, trigger happy. Nope. Okay. I don't think I see any hands up. I can't see everybody at one time, but so I did want to talk a little bit about discounting. I always, for those aren't familiar with discounting, I always joke around. This is the Macy's model, right? So if I go into Macy's and the shirt is $50, I want 20% off. I don't want to have to pay. It hurts my feelings to pay full price, right? We want a discount. And so that's really a very oversimplified way of talking about how we do that in higher ed. And so really in most cases, so for some campuses, like UT Martin is one of those, you have dollars that donors have given that said, hey, we would like this to go towards students to help them offset costs. So those are funded dollars. But then there's other buckets of dollars that are in a budget somewhere, but they're actually not funded by outside dollars. They're just tuition dollars that we've decided to forego in order to enroll the student. So when we look at these discount rate formulas, a tuition and fee discount rate is the one that's more common in looking at. So we take all of the institutional gift aid, all of the scholarship dollars and aid that we have that's controlled by the institution, and we divide that by tuition and fees. An overall discount rate takes just the unfunded aid, so just the money that doesn't have real dollars behind it with donors, and we divide that by all the revenue, so tuition, fees, room, and board. I hear maybe a question. All right. So when we look at four-year publics, what we see overall in an overall discount rate. So for campuses that have a large population of residential students, they tend to focus a little bit more on that overall discount rate because you are generating room and board revenue, particularly if you have most of your facilities are paid for and that type of thing, right? Where only that auxiliary revenue is going toward your food service, but that's really about all. Overall, we see about a 14.4% discount rate for public institutions. And so with that then translates into is about $17,000 in overall net revenue per student. Again, this is looking at tuition fees, room and board. But the way we break out public institutions often is between residents and non-residents, that being in-state students, residents of the state of Tennessee versus non-residents. And so you can see we spend the cost or the discount rate for out-of-state students tends to be a little higher. It's a little more difficult to get students to cross Tennessee lines into Tennessee. They may not get, if they're coming from Kentucky, they're not going to get the Kentucky grant that they might get there. And again, they're having to come across, but we still do generally, because most of those students live on campus, we do generally generate more overall revenue, even though we might spend a little bit more money. And you can see that here, the average institutional gift aid is $3,000 for residents, but almost $8,000 for students from outside of the home state. The other reason we look at out of state, and UT Martin's no exception here, is one, you guys have done a fantastic job over the last 4 or 5 years of really saturating your local market, of really making a name for UT Martin. As I saw in most of the counties in Tennessee, are getting to that 95, right? And so you get to a point where the numbers just start to decline, and the enrollment just can't all come from continued growth, can't come from the inside state. And so you see that here, most campuses have seen, this is from 18 to 19, about a 1.5% drop in enrollment from their in-state, but are seeing growth in the out-of-state markets because you're able to diversify for multiple states. Again, as you guys are looking at Missouri and Kentucky and Mississippi, and we're seeing some nice application and admit growth from those areas at this point, by the way. Students from outside of the area also do usually melt a little bit higher. Again, it's for the same reason that they yield lower. They're coming from further away. It's sometimes a little more difficult. And again, that will continue to be an issue as we look at what we just saw earlier, that students are wanting to stay closer to home and not go quite so far away. But you touch lots of states nearby, right? So we've got students can still come from a close range and be out of state. When we look at these numbers, this is just really the benchmark data in a different marker. But you can see that overall revenue we talked about at 17.3, again, that includes room and board, really translates into about $8,600 in room and board, in just tuition and fees. And that is, slightly higher. That's the average for folks. For UT Martin, your maintenance fee average revenue is about $6,500 per student. Trying to make sure I pause for questions. When we look at transfer students, we see much lower overall discount rates. So for public institutions, again, about 11%. Transfer students have a much different price sensitivity than freshmen. They don't choose, their top reason for going to school is not necessarily the cost. They're looking for, are my classes going to transfer? Am I going to be able to graduate quickly? And oh, by the way, how much is the cost? So they have a little bit more willingness to pay. So we tend to see them funded at a little bit lower rate. They do generate more revenue. You can see here that average tuition revenue about $10,000 compared to the $8,600 we were seeing on the freshmen. For UT Martin, that is, hang on, I have it over here. Oh, sorry, the freshman was $5,800. The transfers are $6,500. So we have almost $1,000 more per student from transfer market. And again, that group though is definitely a risk over this year, looking at the number of students from two-year schools that are enrolled and their capacity to to make that transition. So that will be a group we'll be targeting and reviewing pretty specifically over the next few months. All right. So Jamie said to me earlier this week, "What happened to good news, Sylvia?" I said, "Well, I don't know." I was like, there was a little good news at the beginning of the call, and he had missed it. So we might be past the good news already, unfortunately. But looking at the projection of high school graduates, I'm just reporting the data, Jamie. I'm not creating it. So we can see that over the next 10 years, as I mentioned, we are seeing the red areas. This is not a political map. To your question earlier, but this is the red shows where we see the largest declines in projections here. So about a 2% for Tennessee. Down here, even in Texas, we're only seeing a 2% increase, which is again down quite a bit for that. And even big states like California are expecting an 11% decline. The declines prior to the last 5 years or so have been pretty focused in on the Midwest and the Northeast, but you can see they've really spread out again as those there was literally fewer students being born. The Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education puts these projections together. They do it about every 4 or 5 years. I've been waiting. So this was 2016 that projected out to 2031. I feel like any day now we should be getting an update for another 5 or 10 years. But it's a combination of birth rates, census data, and college continuation rates. So what percentage of high school graduates, finish and complete. And so when we look at those changes, even where we're seeing some increases, most of the change that we're going to see in high school graduates is in students of color. So, in Tennessee, we're talking about 5.5% increase. That's obviously why Dr. Carver mentioned at the beginning, you guys are working to, to serve these students more, serve them better, because there's just going to be more of them, and it's going to be an important group. When we look at the South, so here's the good news, Jamie, just for the next couple of years. We are in a little bit of an increase, projected increase, but then there's a pretty decent cliff after 2025. So here at that 2021 mark, been kind of stable. We should see over the next couple of years some increases. But again, we're seeing a 6-point decline over the next 10 years in Caucasian students. Our Black students will be flat. So some short-term increase, a lot of this increase is our Black students. Big declines in that American Indian population, although there's a small number of them, and pretty big increase in the Hispanic students, which again is the second largest group in the South. A lot of this gets driven by Texas, right? We have 300,000 students just in Texas. So looking at Tennessee is also important. And again, we are right here. So in this kind of flat area, so we see a similar trend in Tennessee, some pretty big increases over the short 5-year time frame, like 7% increase in Black students, 42% increase in Hispanic students. But then it's a pretty drastic drop, not just down to where we are now, but below where we are now. So dropping, another 2,000 students from where we are currently. But from here, we're talking about a drop of, about 4,000 students over that same time frame. Okay. And then, with the growth of those students of color, again, these are medians. And so, don't want to paint every student with the same brush, but we do see that students of color in general in Hispanic and Black communities do have lower median incomes. So, we tend to see a little bit more price sensitivity in there. That's why things like the Tennessee Promise and the UT Promise are so appealing to so many families. And we've often talked about, it's not necessarily always about spending more money on those families, but just educating them and letting them know and helping them understand that where they fall, they probably were already going to get most of their tuition paid for. And so we're eliminating that barrier from even the application process. I think, really opens those doors and helps families along. The secondary piece of that is that we do see different average ACTs by ethnicity and race. And so the national average there at 20.8, our Caucasian population's at 22.2, our Asian population almost at 25. But we see, these lower averages for the students of color that we generally serve. As we talked about, ACT and SAT are less and less available with all of the things happening in the world. I think that most campuses will be moving away from using standardized tests in the way that we've used them in the past to measure college readiness and or for placement, which will be the bigger hit, I think, for a lot of campuses. So it's important to note, where these differences are. But really, in general, students have not been super prepared for college. So, we're looking at, there are 4 sections of the ACT: English, reading, math, and science. And so ACT measures, if they meet the benchmarks for 3 or more of those, they're college ready. And you can see even all students, we look at all students, only 1/3 of them are meeting 3 or more benchmarks. Again, we see some variance here between Caucasian, Hispanic, Asian, African American, for example, so a little bit lower percentages, but we're not doing great overall. So I think it's just helping understand how we can help all students to be more successful in the classroom, be better prepared, and then really making a dent, as you mentioned, Dr. Carver, on those graduation rates. That's the ultimate goal, right? To recruit graduates and alumni. The other piece I think is important to note, and again, this is going to become less and less important, but these are ACT score distributions for the state of Tennessee. So sometimes I have campuses that say, well, we want more 35 ACTs. Okay, that's, the highest is a 36. So of the students that are taking the ACT, only 2% make above a 33 ACT. So if we say that's the group we want to recruit, that group keeps getting smaller and smaller, right? And so looking at this, the growth is happening in kind of the more moderate scores. And again, your minimum has been 20. And so you can see where there's, those percentages have kind of shifted over the years. All right. I know there's some interest in transfer enrollment, so I did want to talk a little bit about demographics when we look at 2-year schools. So this full-time and part-time enrolled here. The full-time enrollment is the number we kind of focus in on when we're looking at transfers from 2-year schools, because that's the group that's most likely to transfer. You have seen a decline, as most campuses have, or most states have in the country, not as much as we're seeing in other areas. But, there was some decline here, a little bit of lift in these last couple of years. But as I mentioned, we are seeing about a 10% decline in enrollment overall. And it's pretty equally full-time and part-time students across the country in those 2-year schools. Nope, question? All right. This is just a perspective thing that I think is always important for folks to get. And Edie, tell me if I'm coming up about my time, because I don't actually know what time I started. 65,000. Okay, 5,000 high school seniors in 2019-20 in Tennessee. So I often say, looks like we should just be able to, we got 1,100, can't we get 1,200? There's 65,000 out there. But there's also 101 institutions of higher education competing for those same schools, not to mention some schools in different states. Also, Tennessee has about a 62% college continuation rate. So, there's a lot of those students who don't end up even going on to school. So you guys are about 27th in the nation with your college continuation rate. About 16% then also leave the state to go to school. So by the time we take all these students kind of out of the mix, we've got about 34,000 students to recruit from for those 101 institutions of higher education, which would be about 338 per students per institution. I don't think anybody would be happy with that number, since you guys have obviously done historically much better than that, particularly in the last few years. Of the 1,100 students you enrolled this fall, 1,000 of them were from Tennessee. So you're definitely doing much better than kind of that average. But there's also campuses that are much larger than UT Martin, bringing in a little bit larger share of that institution. But I bet there's plenty of smaller privates that would love to have 338 students. So that gives us a little bit of context. The other piece, the last piece we talked about was in relation to retention. So when we look at retention, people always ask me, well, what's the average retention around the country? I said, well, on average, it's about 70 to 74%. But it's really, there's a lot of variance based on the institution type and the selectivity of the institution. So in this case, this is ACT selectivity scale based on the ACT middle 50% or SAT middle 50%. So you guys are generally kind of, your average ACT is about a 21. So you're at the high end of traditional, at the low end of selective. And, you could kind of fall either way. But when we look at retention rates, you can see there's a pretty big variance between the traditional and the selective. These traditional campuses are in that 71 to 74 range. Selective institutions are really in that 80 plus percentage range. So there's a big jump that happens there when you have a change in selectivity. But as I mentioned, with us, test scores generally going away, there's going to have to be different ways to measure that selectivity. You guys are at the high end of your retention rates, at the high end of this traditional group, but not quite where we see those selective institutions. When I threw a few of these in there, just I thought that would be helpful. Some things that we see public institutions doing with relation to retention management and being successful at. So 93% of them are obviously tracking persistence. You guys are do a great job with this too, term by term, figuring out who's enrolling and continuing and persisting. Identifying courses where students are struggling, identifying where each of the academic programs is with relation to retention, what courses maybe are a little bit more difficult, and then providing assessments to identify what students' needs are and where you can address those. So they continue on with lots of different other things here. But I think, again, you guys have a lot of these best practices in place and are able to meet these needs for the students pretty well. But this is an important piece of it. As I mentioned, you don't want to be bringing in, great numbers of students at the beginning and then having to replace them every year because we're, not retaining students. I think we saw some really good retention rates this fall. And so that's really positive. And again, you guys have been working on that pretty solidly over the last few years and have seen some nice strides.
Sylvia,
yes, sir.
This is Keith. Can I add something about retention?
Please.
I think right now would be a good point to talk about three things that are happening right now. First, we've just hired a brand new director of financial aid, and so I think what you're going to see, and Sylvia, you know about this, is one of the things that this is going to do is usher in a whole new way to look at student debt, working with our students, working with parents. Which also helps with retention, right? I mean, if you're you're making college affordable, you're making wise decisions, you're more likely to persist and stay in. So we're extremely excited about that. Another piece that's just happened that we've not made too public yet, but we just received a $100,000 cash gift to specifically address African American retention in their freshman year, and that's going to be a great activity this year. Obviously, we've got some best practices that we've gathered from other places, but to be able to put the $100,000 into that effort specifically and see how that helps with retention is going to be outstanding. That was a donor gift, and we're excited about that. Final thing I'll say. And it's been about recruiting, but when you talked about retention, it really caught my eye again to talk about it. Is about a year and a half ago we hired Nancy Sanchez, and Nancy is our very first bilingual recruitment counselor, admissions counselor that we have, and Nancy's great. As a matter of fact, she's profiled in the University of Tennessee System-Wide Alumni magazine that just came out this month. What we've seen is Nancy's great, not only talking to the parents, grandparents of many students, where the students may not have a language barrier, but certainly the family has barriers, and they have questions about the college culture, which has been great. But Nancy has been incredible for retention because as students, as a Hispanic student comes to campus, someone's recruited them, but also Nancy is also now a counselor and a friend and an advocate on campus. And so
Sure.
really looking at and tracking the retention of our Hispanic, Latino, Latina students since Nancy's arrival, and thinking about what that does to insert a new member of the university community as a staff member, and what that does for retention. So I'm really excited to see what turns and what gains we make in retention area because of those three things. So I just wanted to put that bug in your ear.
Absolutely. No, I think that is fantastic. And you're absolutely right. One of the top reasons a student doesn't retain is financial. And that's the first thing that we hear. And so understanding whether it's I can't afford it anymore or I don't see the value, right? And so those personal relationships that counselors like Nancy have, and advisors have with students and such, are the things that help us to really understand what it is that our students need and where those gaps are. But obviously gaps in language, gaps in just we have a large percentage of first generation students. I had a friend of mine I was helping through this process, and she was like, "This is the most confusing thing I've ever been through. You're the only person on the planet that understands it." And I'm like, well, I mean, that's not even true, but it is a complex process, right? Think of, I always think it's like a high risk purchase, like buying a home. The stack of paperwork that you have to sign when you buy a home is ridiculous, and nobody understands what any of it says, right? We're just all signing it. I had a student when I was on campus come to me one time with a big packet of information and say, "This is everything that financial aid has sent me. What do I actually need?" So the more we can demystify that aid process and again, provide financial literacy to these families, not just coming in, but enabling them to retain, obviously the more successful they're going to be and the more successful we'll be as an institution. Absolutely. And that actually is the end of my presentation. Questions, comments? Again, it was super high level, hopefully, overview. Lots going on in higher education, lots of moving parts, but we are in the boat with you.
Sylvia, we thank you. Are there any
Absolutely.
Sylvia?
This is Philip Smart. I have a quick question, and it
Sure.
might actually require some of our folks to answer it as well. You may mention, Sylvia, that one of the things that we at UT Martin are probably going to have to get better at is pulling students across state lines.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the barriers that we have of being able to offer in-state tuition to out-of-state students? And then are there ways we can leverage that to maybe recruit students to Martin?
Yeah, so that's a very common conversation. We do have some ways. So we don't offer in-state tuition. That's Peter probably wants to talk about that, but we don't offer in-state tuition to these out-of-state students. But we do have offered them a scholarship that's pretty close to in-state tuition if they are qualifying for that scholarship. We did expand the qualifications for that scholarship a little bit this year. That way there'll be more students. And then of course we also now have folks working in these areas and these regions to establish relationships and help, there to be just a little bit more on the ground, help getting these students to move across the state lines.
And Philip, here, we've done some discounting, especially, at first we looked at several years ago, looking at the contiguous counties, all these states we touch. Then we talked about, a mile radius. And then through some scholarship discounting, we just sort of opened it up to out of state. One of the issues we have in Tennessee is it's a little bit of a political question where you have a lot of stakeholders that will say, we don't want our tax dollars supporting a student from Missouri as much as we want our tax dollars supporting someone from Tennessee. And so you hear that, and that's a constant conversation. And I'm certainly not saying that's right or wrong, but it's a reality with certain stakeholders that we have to talk about. But one of the great things is through our work with Sylvia, through our work with Petra and Phil and Jamie and our system counterparts, is we are looking for what's the best way to discount and structure and recruit, enable to capitalize that. And so, Philip, one thing I'd like to say, and you probably don't know this, but we've just hired a St. Louis recruiter, someone to live and operate out of St. Louis, because when you look at our programs that we're offering and what's hot here, including some of the programs that you're teaching in, which is great, but that is an area that's going to be a real hot spot for us. And so we've got someone assigned to that greater St. Louis area. If that works well, I think you'll see more of that as we expand. Because, Sylvia, we're, when you look at St. Louis, a lot of those universities that the in-state students in that area, we're competitive or cheaper than a lot of those universities. So, just continuing to leverage that and where they are and putting our resources there. But it is a great question.
Yes, and Dr. Carver, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's varying levels of those kinds of conversations at the state level in all states. I mean, I have a campus in a different state where they absolutely cannot spend $1 of state-funded dollars on out-of-state students for that exact reason. So it does become a little more difficult. We understand that rationale, but at the same time, we also see that out-of-state students can bring a lot to the campus, additional revenue, but also, more diversity. And we can't continue, not every campus can continue to grow just using the students in their state. There's just not enough of them.
Sylvia, we'll take all the Texas students you'll send us.
I know. We'll get a pipeline going.
Well, I was going to say, one of my very best students, she was from Pennsylvania. She came here because, one, she really liked the area, but she was able to go and pay out of state cheaper than her in-state. And then once she came here, she stayed. She works now for Tennessee State Parks. I fully expect her to be running the system in a few years. But,
Sure.
Getting great talent to Tennessee, I think we can do it.
Absolutely.
I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Keith, what kinds of things can you utilize the $100,000 for recruiting diverse students?
It's Moniz, I'm sorry, it's on retention, so it'll be for the students that are already here, but setting up, looking at mentoring programs and getting the mentor, which is obviously a best practice, doing some out-of-class activities with the students to help build community, but also academic and advising support. So, we're really excited because I think if we're successful in this first year, I think there's going to be more folks that are interested in contributing to this. So, Moniz, I tell you what I'll do. I'll via email. Well, I tell you, with all our advisory board via email, I'll send you sort of the sketched out draft of what that program's going to look like. But it's a full, comprehensive deal. And Moniz, I think it's great to start with our African American students, but I hope someday we'll have people that are interested in helping us with our adult students and our student veterans. But I think all of these opportunities like this, there are going to be some nuggets in working with the different populations that are going to be applicable to all populations on campus. And I'm just really excited about it. But I'll send all of you. Edie just made a note. I saw her. And I'll send you a document that talks more about it.
Yes, that's a fantastic and super exciting initiative to be able to dedicate those resources, not only to aid to the students, but to programming. And like you said, those are the things that building those communities and building those connections and having as much support as you can for those students is really the key to keeping them connected and enrolled.
Are there any other questions of Sylvia? Hearing none, Sylvia, that was a great presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Work with you, T. Martin.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Y'all have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Before I turn it over to the Chancellor, Petra, how much ahead of budget are you?
Could you define ahead?
$1? How are you doing with your budget?
We're actually doing okay with budget. We're waiting to see what our spring enrollment looks like, so that we'll have a better idea of any adjustments we need to make for the year. But right now, we are able to maintain with the use of the CARES money has been very helpful for those additional expenses that we picked up, particularly related to PPE.
Okay.
And I will add that we're also getting clarification on the second round of coronavirus relief funds and what we will be able to do with it. It will provide more flexibility, but we have to get the specifics of the dates that we can utilize the money, because revenue loss is one of the items that we can use the new round for, but the date that starts, the effective date, is going to be key.
Okay. Chancellor, I'll ask you for any additional comments that you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to address just a couple of things. One sort of overall statement, and then some real good news as we close. First, I sent you all a statement yesterday about an incident on campus where some real inflammatory language was used in one of our before one of our virtual classes started. And I think what that's all about, and what I'm trying to get at, is when I talk about speech, it's what we say to one another, and also how we say it. And I think one of the things I'm trying to help our campus talk about is, just because we've got the right to say something, to really think about the implications and consequences of our words, and how words can hurt, how words can separate, and how words can divide. And we're really trying here as a campus to foster a climate of civility, and a place where we can have differing opinions, and we can talk about those opinions, but also foster some mutual respect for each other while we're on campus. And I know it's an issue that we want to address here, but I also know that it's an issue that as a nation, COVID crisis, it's really hard to get people together and talk about things like this. And so we're trying to be creative, doing some town halls, letting students visit and talk with faculty and staff. I know our faculty are working really hard in their classrooms to make sure students have the opportunity to connect. But there's just a lot of isolation right now. And so bringing people together to talk is a good thing. Before the meeting started, you all probably heard Moniece Hagler and I talking about a speaker. Moniece has been kind enough to help us find a real authority on free speech. And so we're going to have a program on campus for our students and faculty and staff and anyone. And I'll send the information out to the board to really talk about it. And where are those boundaries, and why is it important to have this component of free speech, but also, when does that get into where it's inflammatory or hate speech? And it's a great time to be talking about it. I know that I'm going to be sharing the link to campus, but certainly any alums or anyone on the advisory board that will want to be a part of that, we can do it. It's just one part of our campus activity. Am I having?
You're having trouble on the side.
Okay. Okay. I was having microphone problems. Finally, talk a little bit about our buildings and capital projects. We talked about the Latimer building, our wonderful new STEM building. It's coming along. It's on time. It's looking great. If you're coming from downtown, you see a 7-story crane on campus. I don't know when that's happened in the last 40 years, but it's exciting to see the progress. We'll be in that in April of 22, and I'm extremely excited about that. The other project going on right now is we're about to complete a renovation of our visitor bleachers in Hardy Graham Stadium. There was a seismic event. I called it an earthquake. I was told by the insurance company I can't call it that, but it was a seismic event that caused some issues to that some time ago. We fixed that, and we're getting stands back on to get ready for our football season, which will be played this spring because of COVID. The next two projects that you're going to see coming about, the Tennessee Higher Education Commission just approved a building project to be placed on their capital priority list. So that's the first hurdle. The second hurdle is it in the governor's budget? And we'll find that out on February the 9th, so cross your fingers. But it's the Innovation and Product Realization Center. And there's makerspace in there. There's space for dirty labs for our students in ag and engineering, in other disciplines to go and work on projects. There's place for makerspace for new project design for the community to work on. There's places where if Julia were here, I'd tell her Pick Suite could get one of the bays and they could set up a line and they could test a new product without having to shut down something there. I think equally exciting about this project is it will place UT Martin, Dyersburg State, and TCAT McKenzie under the same roof. Right here in Martin, we'll have those three institutions working together on our campus, and I'm extremely excited. It gets to workforce development, it gets to degree completion, but folks, we need to be working together, and West Tennessee is going to rise if we are working together to address our education and our workforce needs. So extremely excited. If the governor owes you any favors, it's time to call when. I'm kidding. Not really, but yes. But we are excited about that, and it's got a great chance. It's got a great chance to be approved on February 9th. Two other things on the horizon. One, short term, you're going to be hearing more from me about an ag research building and a project which is in short view in front of us. We've started raising money for that. And we can talk more about that in the future when we've got a little more in terms of drawings and ideas, but also finishing the next phase on our fine arts facility, which will be a great addition to not just the arts on our campus, but also be a cultural hub for Northwest Tennessee, but also really promote tourism and more entertainment opportunities for our region. So lots of great things going on. We'll talk maybe, Mr. Chairman, maybe we can have a fundraising update at our next meeting. I won't get into that today, but some exciting things going on in the fundraising realm too. So I just am so thankful for your support. I appreciate your engagement with this board. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield my time and be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of Keith? Hearing none, then, excuse me, was there a question? Hearing none, the last item is closing remarks from the chair. You know, we don't realize what UT Martin means to West Tennessee. It hit home when I was in Jackson General for nearly 2 weeks, and to a person, I was surprised at the number of staff, RNs, tech, lab people that came in and said, "Oh, I went to UT Martin." And to a person, they had something very good to say about UT Martin. Sometimes we don't step back and realize how fortunate we are in spite of Dr. Carver, and I'm kidding, to adjourn.
So moved, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you're doing well.
Amen.
Thank you, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.